Well, welcome again to In the Chair, where our guest today is again Dr Rob McFarlane from the Cabinet Office. Good afternoon, Rob.
Good afternoon.
You're here today to talk about the standards world, and how do I describe you? Well, you're the chairman of the British Standards Institute's Societal Security Committee. That's quite a tongue twister, isn't it?
It's a bit of a mouthful.
Rob, what does that work involve you in?
I'm not an employee of BSI, British Standards Institution. None of the technical committee chairs are. But we're judged to be subject matter experts, if I can say that, in our respective field. Societal security management is a little bit ambiguous, to be honest. It's got a very broad range and sits alongside the risk management and the business continuity and the security management committee. So what really sort of falls in our area, a lot of stuff that would be recognisably emergency management, command and control, CBRN, warning and informing, working with volunteers, all of that sort of stuff. Both the production of British standards, but also, and this is actually quite an important area, liaison up with international standards organisation to make sure that stuff emerging from ISO, international standards, is acceptable to us in the UK and helpful to UK practitioners.
And you've been telling me that there's a whole new raft of standards coming our way.
There are quite a few. We're always working on new standards, but one of the things that I want to do in my period of tenure as chair, a few months into it now, it'll be 3 years in total, is actually make better sense of what's already been published to practitioners. Because certainly I know that talking to practitioners, the standards landscape is quite cluttered, there's loads of stuff being published, and its relevance to practitioners in councils, in police forces and so on is not necessarily all that clear. So I think from the standards world, if I can use that point of view, we've got to present what we do much more clearly. We've got to demonstrate why it's of interest and value to practitioners, and I think a huge amount of it is of huge relevance to them. But also make the links between what are currently quite disparate standards in a much more effective way. It's got to be a more coherent offering that's demonstrably of use to people.
One of the things you've been saying is that we should expect sometime soon some new work in the field of validation.
There's a number of different proposals that we're working on at the moment, and validation is certainly one. So it doesn't yet exist as a standard.
But it sounds very airy-fairy. I mean, what are you trying to achieve here?
What we're talking about is the exam question really is, how do you validate your capabilities? So we're talking here in a UK resilience perspective. To my mind, a plain English definition of a capability is a demonstrable ability to do something under specified circumstances. So we're quite comfortable, most of us, talking about capabilities in the context of flood rescue or urban search and rescue or chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear and so on. But what validation is about is that word demonstrable. So it's not just you say you've got that ability to rescue a certain number of people under certain conditions, etc., but you can show that you really do. So validation is actually moving it in a sense from paper, the claim we can do this, to actually showing that when push comes to shove in reality, you really can. And at the moment it strikes us there's a little bit of a gap. We've got capabilities programs within government and at the local level doing really, really good work with, let's be honest, decreasing resources. And where standards do exist at the moment, they're really quite specific. Training and exercising your business continuity plan being one of them. So where we want to focus in on is the gap, to get people to really understand what validation means and how you do it properly. So when you come back to that definition, a demonstrable ability to, you are actually able to demonstrate to your local communities, to your political, executive, etc., that you really can do this stuff. So it's not just about, comfortably showing that on a good day we could do this. It's about under the expected, reasonable worst case scenario, we will be able to do what we say we can.
And will this be in the form of guidance, or will this be, a formal requirement of people?
Yeah, no, it's a good distinction. There's basically two different kinds of standards. There are others, but two broad types.
It's a good distinction. There's basically two different kinds of standards. There are others, but two broad types. One is a specification standard, and that is the kind of thing which describes in quite prescriptive form a process. They're effectively management system standards. It defines how you do something from A through to Z, and they're actually standards against which an organisation can be certificated or audited. We're not talking about that sort of standard here, we're talking about a guidance standard, which is much more indicative. It tells you, it lays clear the concepts, and it describes a general framework for working, but it doesn't tell you precisely how you've got to do it.
Even so, there'll be people listening to this interview in the emergency management business and the resilience industry who will be thinking, not more standards. Could you already describe the economic circumstance in which people find themselves now, less money to spend, and yet you seem to be saying we're going to make life a little bit tougher for you in terms of what we expect of you?
Sure. Well, we absolutely don't intend to make things tougher. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the demands on people. It's not just the diminishing resource in terms of the number of people and the resources and the assets they've got, but to what degree the expectations have actually changed. So if we look at, for example, some central government guidance, then it may run to several hundred pages, certainly a couple of hundred pages in one particular example I'm thinking of. At the moment, the interrelationship between standards, which can be much shorter, and that government issue guidance is not explicit and clear. And that's one of the things that I want to look at. How do we actually make a much more explicit link between government issue guidance, which may be shorter in the future, less is more being a useful principle, and standards, which may actually enable people to get much more into the detail of how you do things. So I think it's quite a useful distinction there between what you need to be able to do, where you need to get to, and standards potentially developing much more detail around how you actually fulfill.
So standard is designed to be helpful.
Oh God, absolutely, no question about that.
Not a hurdle that you have to overcome.
I'm not interested in hurdles. We're interested in helping people, meet their statutory duties. It's not just about statutory duties; it's about broader social obligations as well.
Well, let's turn to the subject of more resilient cities, because I know this is another area of work that you're looking at within this group that you chair. This is quite a sexy subject at the moment. There are a couple of big projects going on around the world, one led by the UN, one funded by Rockefeller, trying to create a resilient city. Do we have any examples of what a resilient city looks like? I assume not yet.
No, I would hesitate to point to one singular. I think it would probably be tricky to do so. What we do have are a number of cities which have been internationally recognised. So the United Nations has identified Greater Manchester as a highly resilient city, and also the Rockefeller Foundation 100 Resilient Cities programme, which is about assisting cities to build their resilience in a way that fits what they are, who they are, and what they're trying to achieve, where they want to get to. Have identified 3 UK cities, Glasgow, London and Bristol, in the first 2 rounds of their programme. So they're building up to ultimately identifying 100 resilient cities. So you're absolutely right, there's a lot of work going on, and there's some really interesting sort of methodology and assessment frameworks which have been built up in the background. What we're interested in doing is immediately we've got 2, not necessarily competing, hopefully consistent, but you do have 2 points of reference. One of the things that I think standards are useful as is a brand that has some authority and credibility. So if I look at this from a senior executive's point of view in a major urban area in the UK in 2 or 3 years' time, or indeed an elected mayor or community leaders or business leaders or what have you, you're absolutely right. Resilience as a concept is, it's on the up. Another concept that was very much a number of years ago on the up seems to be waning slightly, which is sustainability. And one of the things that we're very interested to do is actually sort of handshake, if that's not too naff a term, those 2 ideas. Sustainability has got quite a sort of a green sort of tinge to it. It's got quite a strong environmental association. Resilience at the moment has got quite a strong safety and security and emergency crisis response and recovery feel. In actual fact, to our mind, resilience is a framework that embraces security, it embraces sustainability, and it's a potentially very, very useful framework to look at a whole series of activities and imperatives that city executives and local communities are facing and trying to achieve, but bring them all together. I can elaborate, that probably sounds terribly vague like that, but if you look at something like flood risk management, it's focused on rivers. But what else are rivers of interest for? They're interested in biodiversity and wildlife conservation terms. So immediately you've got a sustainability thing, and you've got something that's typically identified as resilience. Does the management of that one thing for two objectives is it actually potentially reconcilable? And then you look at the other things that might be of interest. People talk about sustainable transport, they talk about compact cities. There's a lot of issues around public health. If you look at future cities being hotter, not cooler, then green spaces become hugely important in mitigating the effects of sort of hotter cities. So all of these things are actually pointing towards, well, here's an old-fashioned word, an integrated management of the same thing to meet multiple objectives. And that is actually really quite close to what you're trying to achieve with resilience.
Do you think the citizens will notice that they live in a more resilient city? Will it have an impact? Or is it simply a management tool?
I think it is a way of looking at the city as a whole, but not just the city in its broader context. So, for example, we understand perfectly well that one of the flood risk, the components of flood risk, is actually what is upstream in terms of the river systems. So you can do a lot of work upstream to reduce the speed with which heavy rainfall actually pulses through into cities and thereby causing flooding. So what we're trying to do here is take resilience as an idea that's been applied to organisations and to networks and to teams and so on, and apply it in an explicitly geographical sense. So it's not at its core, and I should emphasise this is very early stage work in progress. I shouldn't really be second guessing where it's going to end up too much. Maybe you're right. It at the moment is not placing a sufficiently strong emphasis on the citizen, but it absolutely has got their interests, whether it's their security, their safety, their health, in focus. That is the rationale for higher levels of resilience.
But finally, Rob, the challenge here is enormous, isn't it? Creating a set of standards that will enable city managers, city planners to create a resilient city in every aspect of the way that city works and the way that it embraces the people who live there. That's a huge task, isn't it?
It is. I don't think it means we shouldn't try it. I think you've got to stretch. I would balk slightly at the word resilient, because resilience is a relative state. And I think it's a very dangerous territory to be saying you can be a resilient in an absolute sense. Person, an organisation, a network, or indeed a city. I think this is about better, it's about more resilient. Yeah. So what we're trying to establish here is a framework for cities to actually look at the various things that, the risks that relate to them, the assets and opportunity they have, the culture that pervades that city, and actually think, right, what can we do to actually build our resilience? So improvements are worth having, and what we want to lay down here is a framework for building, more resilience. So it's about progressively building that over a period of time. It's not about reaching a pure resilient and state and then, that being the end of it. You never get that.
Rob McFarlane, thank you.
Thank you.